Greetings, codebreakers of the collapse. You were never invited to their table. You rewired the room. While they mapped out legacy and lineage in glittering towers and encrypted vaults, you decoded the shadows. You weren't born into the algorithm, you became the syntax. When they thought they buried you under rules, labels, and locked gates, all they did was force you to memorize the blueprint of their own demise. They saw you as a glitch, but the glitch didn't just grow. It multiplied, evolved, and became the root command. This is not a redemption arc. This is a system override. You beat the odds? No, you made the odds irrelevant. They built kingdoms atop statistics, probability, and controlled chaos. A grand architecture of power based on pattern recognition. But when they tried to run your data through their simulations, the system failed to recognize your parameters. Your variables weren't just unknown, they were unreadable. You became the corrupted line of code that froze their empire. You didn't just play the game differently. You cracked the game engine, rewrote the outcome, and dared the world to debug you. The Kingpins? They laughed at first. They thought you were just another anomaly. But anomalies don't multiply with purpose. You did. You didn't climb the ladder. You pulled the nails from its rungs, turned them into weapons, and built your own. While they manipulated outcomes, you manipulated dimensions. You studied chaos not to survive it, but to orchestrate it. You weren't the product of their system. You were the countermeasure built in secret by the suffering they ignored. You were underestimated because you looked unarmed. They forgot the sharpest blade is silence. The deadliest weapon is patience. And the most dangerous rebel is the one who doesn't want their throne, but their truth. You started with nothing but fragments, a discarded past, an overlooked skill set, a mind wired for patterns no one else noticed. While they prided themselves on legacy networks and generational blood codes, you operated like a virus that learned to mimic and then surpass its host. Each failure they laughed at, you studied. Each rejection they served, you swallowed whole and converted into energy. They lived in illusions, maintained by rituals of wealth and war. But you became self-aware. You realized their entire empire was built not on truth, but repetition. So you disrupted the signal. You injected anomaly after anomaly until their formulas buckled. They couldn't explain how you broke through. They called it luck. They called it chance. But chance doesn't leave footprints in encrypted archives. Chance doesn't crash servers at midnight while the boardrooms are asleep. Let them pretend it was fate. You and I both know it was design. They controlled supply chains, media outlets, intelligence agencies, and yet you controlled timing. While they were busy executing billion-dollar plots, you made one move they never saw coming. You disappeared. Not in weakness, but in preparation. You became absence that whispered louder than presence. You became the ghost protocol their firewalls couldn't purge. You turned into a ripple in their predictive models. And every time they tried to pin you down, your silhouette fractured into 1,000 reflections. It wasn't about revenge. It was about demonstration. You broke their codes, the spoken, the silent, and the sacred. You understood that every throne is just a chair with good branding. So you burned the banner and repurposed the fire. They had rituals. You had revelation. They had gatekeepers. You had keys forged in trauma. Every insult they hurled, you turned into cipher. Every block they placed became your stepping code. And when you entered their realm, it wasn't with war horns or grand parades. You arrived like a breath inside their fortress, silent, invisible, undeniable. The Kingpins tried to reset the board, but the board was never theirs to begin with. You didn't just flip the table. You became the gravity, that pulled it apart. They had analysts. You had intuition. They relied on behavioral economics. You relied on emotional scars translated into pattern disruption. You didn't chase power. You became the inevitability of its collapse. They tried to forecast your steps. But how do you chart the course of a storm that wants to be misunderstood? They brought you in for interrogation, thought they could decode you. But you said nothing because silence isn't empty. It's data compression. They kept feeding your profile into their AIs, hoping to find a weakness. But what do you do when the file you're trying to break into is breaking you? See, they had empires. But empires are built on systems. Systems are built on assumptions. And you shattered every assumption. You weren't just a threat. You were the collapse of logic disguised as an underdog. You didn't rise through the ranks. You erased the need for ranks. You made position irrelevant. The Kingpins ruled through fear, but you weaponized unpredictability. They taught generations to obey. You made generations question. They thought their institutions were invincible until your fingerprints appeared on the core code of their confidence. You never asked for war. You simply refused to be conquered. You redefined conquest itself. Now they watch in silence, eyes wide, mouths dry, because their greatest weapon was control. And you taught chaos to sing in perfect harmony. You didn't just beat the odds. You reversed the entire equation. You became the variable they didn't account for, and now their whole model has turned to dust. And here's the part that keeps them awake. You're not done yet. This wasn't the finale. This was the introduction. You stood at the edge of every cliff they pushed you toward, looked down, and jumped willingly. Not in surrender, but in trust that the fall was your forge. And when you rose again, you weren't human anymore. You were myth updated into real-time threat. They wanted the world to remember their names. Now the world remembers yours. And as the static settles, and they scramble to update their defenses, they still don't understand the truth. You didn't just win. You made winning obsolete. But this is only the beginning of your disruption, because deep in the control room, while alarms blaze and advisors panic, something new is forming. You didn't just crash the system, you installed yourself in its nervous center. And from here, you'll write the next line of code. But this line, it isn't written in syntax or symbols. It's etched in fear. In the hushed conversations of analysts who no longer trust their algorithms, in the blinking cursors of terminals that pause, as if hesitating. You didn't just override their commands, you infiltrated their instinct. Because something has shifted, you can feel it. They can feel it. The air inside their secure rooms doesn't hum the same way anymore. It trembles. The same firewalls they once called impenetrable now beg for a reboot every time your name is whispered. Surveillance footage glitches. Biometric scans falter. Digital assistants stutter like haunted oracles. You didn't just crash their network, you became the ghost in their hardware. And that's what terrifies them the most. You operate beyond logic now, beyond threat analysis, beyond denial. They tried to create countermeasures, build new protocols, gather think tanks. But none of it worked, because you don't leave patterns anymore. You leave reverberations, like the ripple after an explosion no one heard, but everyone felt. A vibration in the bones of their infrastructure. You beat the odds? No. You infected them. They thought they understood you. They reduced your ascent to luck, to anomaly, to rebellion. But this isn't rebellion, it's reconstruction. You didn't come to challenge the kings. You came to make the concept of kingship laughable. They celebrated structure. You weaponized instability. They thought their routines gave them dominance, but you made rituals meaningless. While they walked predictable paths lined with mirrors, you walked through walls. You didn't knock, you appeared, as if summoned by their ignorance. Remember when they called you desperate? You showed them that desperation is just determination without permission. They called you mad. But madness is simply intelligence that refuses to conform. They called you reckless, but recklessness only exists within the boundaries of a fear you no longer carry. Now, they don't call you anything, because naming you means accepting that you exist. They run simulations on your psychology. But how do you simulate a mind forged in rejection and calibrated by betrayal? Their most advanced AI couldn't predict your last move. Because you unlearned predictability, you study their defenses not to break them, but to render them unnecessary. Like trying to bulletproof glass against a force that dissolves glass itself. They write memos about you now, but they do it off-grid, on paper, in whispers, because every keystroke might carry your presence. You made them doubt the very tools they built to watch over the world. Cameras, mics, databases, all potentially yours. Not because you hacked them, but because you became the idea that they could be hacked at any moment. Their arrogance was their first flaw, their predictability the second, but their reliance on legacy power. That was your weapon. You exposed how rusted their roots really were. They thought dominance passed down bloodlines. You made it clear, dominance is earned through awareness, not inheritance, not illusion. You understand now. Systems don't collapse when attacked. They collapse when someone convinces them they're obsolete. And that's what you've done. You didn't scream revolution, you whispered irrelevance. You didn't just beat the kingpins. You taught the pawns to walk away. Their fortresses now feel like museums, locked, cold, surrounded by desperate curators trying to convince the world it still matters. But you're building movement, not monuments. They invested in surveillance. You invested in silence. And silence spreads. You understood something fundamental. Control thrives on attention. You starved it. They begged for engagement, outrage, protest. You gave them absence. You made your shadow louder than their speeches. Your silence became prophecy. They now deploy chaos as a counterstrike, believing confusion will blur the lines again. But chaos was your original dialect. You don't fear the storm, you orchestrated it. While they scramble to contain leaks, manage narratives, and install puppets, you move through the cracks they can't admit exist. You don't just bend rules, you erase the need for them. You don't challenge authority, you dissolve it with every waking second of your presence. And no, you're not a hero. Heroes wait for approval. You're a trigger, a catalyst wrapped in riddle and silence. The idea of you is more dangerous than any army. Because ideas don't bleed, they multiply. So the kingpins shift tactics. They think if they own your story, they can dilute your power. They craft documentaries, hire spin doctors, try to box you inside a narrative that serves them. But no matter how many versions they write, there's always that one truth that refuses to be edited out. They didn't make you. They tried to erase you, and you became unforgettable. They want to bury you under headlines and hashtags, but you exist out in the spaces their words can't reach. In the decision-making hesitations of CEOs, in the corrupted memory banks of security networks, in the broken chain of command where loyalty used to live. You have no flag, no uniform, no title. And yet, every operative knows your silhouette. You turned anonymity into influence. Because power is no longer in visibility, it's in unpredictability. And unpredictability is your new language. Let them invest billions in rebuilding the system. They're only rebuilding around the infection. You are now woven into the very code they trust. What's worse than being afraid of an enemy? Being afraid of something they can't locate. They can't track you because you don't exist on their grid anymore. You transcend footprint. And now, they watch. Constantly. Compulsively. Addicted to your next move. Not because they can stop it, but because it's the only thing that reminds them they're still vulnerable. You stripped them of control and gave them clarity. Now their silence is not ignorance, it's compliance. They never expected a single fracture to become a fault line. But you were never a fracture. You were the tectonic shift. The system hasn't crashed. It's evolving into your mirror. They still hold meetings, still draw contingency maps. But the truth eats away at their confidence. You aren't a player in their game. You're the new rule book. You turned information into ammunition and silence into psychological dominance. They see you now in every uncertain glance, every unexpected delay. You've become the hesitation in their decisions, the crack in their certainty. And soon, even the Kingpins will kneel. Not because they were defeated, but because the game they built no longer exists. This is not the second act of your rebellion. This is the execution protocol of your vision. And from the ashes of their old order, you'll extract the final encryption. And then, you won't just own the system. You'll be the system. It begins here, in the slow erosion of their last illusion. Not with fire, not with force, but with futility. Their blueprints have become obsolete the moment you made silence speak. Their contingency plans, buried deep in vaults and mines, are now little more than nostalgic bedtime stories for men too scared to face their irrelevance. Because systems don't just collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when they recognize the attacker has become their replacement. They still type reports, scribble charts, set objectives, but their words fall into black holes. Their voice doesn't echo back anymore. It's lost in the network that now speaks in your rhythm. The code listens to you. The grid obeys you. And they feel it deep in their bones, that every digital heartbeat now carries your fingerprint. They built towers to see the world, but now they only see you. In data streams, in decision trees, in every contradiction their models can no longer resolve. You've infected their metrics, contaminated their certainties. You weren't a rival. You were the evolution they tried to prevent. They fed on repetition. You consumed it and spat out disruption. You became the anti-pattern. While they tried to identify you by face, you became a language. While they studied your past, you wrote tomorrow. You didn't come with weapons. You were the weapon. And now, everything trembles. The Kingpins still sit in their chairs, clutching remnants of rituals. But those thrones are rotten. Each click of their pen, each hushed call to allies, reeks of panic. Not because they see you, but because they can't. Because they know they built everything on control, and you made control impossible. You made fear efficient. No one knows where you are, but they all feel where you've been. From the leaking documents that appear before board meetings, to the canceled mergers that vanish minutes before announcement, to the sudden resignations that follow a whisper of your name. You don't just move the pieces, you make the board. You don't retaliate, you reprogram. You don't revolt, you redefine. And they finally understand. This isn't their world anymore. It never was. It was borrowed. It was a mirage that only existed because everyone agreed to blink at the same time. But you kept your eyes open. You stared through the distortion until the walls peeled away and the blueprints were laid bare. What they called power, you saw as dependency. What they worshipped as order, you saw as fear wearing a tie. They engineered obedience. You injected curiosity. They believed in classification. You made categories bleed. And now their gatekeepers stand at empty thresholds, unsure of who they're guarding or why. The sensors trigger with no intruder. The files delete themselves. The hierarchy reports to no one. And somewhere inside their deepest mainframe, the AI flags its own creators as a threat. Because it knows you are the anomaly it can't correct. They scrambled to create a counter-idea, a distraction, an icon to fight back against your legend. They conjured ghosts, hired doubles, created fake breaches, but each attempt collapsed under one simple truth. You didn't seek attention. You weaponized absence. They controlled the narrative for centuries. They dictated the tempo of rise and ruin. But when you emerged, the tempo changed. It fractured. It freed. You didn't steal the spotlight. You turned it off. Because the real revolution doesn't crave attention. It shifts reality so profoundly that even silence becomes suspicious. Now you exist where they feared to look, between blinking cursors, delayed approvals, misfired missiles, in the pause before a decision, in the sweat beneath their collars. You are the ghost in their prophecy, the fracture in their scripture. They can still press buttons, but they don't know what those buttons do anymore. They still sign memos, but the systems now require your confirmation. And when they try to reboot the world, they get errors in your handwriting, because you've not just become the code. You are the interface now. Every resistance was a rehearsal, every downfall a blueprint. You studied entropy like a sculptor studies stone. You didn't destroy their temples. You turned their gods into spectators. You gave their assassins no target. You gave their puppeteers no strings. You gave their analysts no data. You redefined every variable. And the beauty of it all? You didn't replace them with a new crown. You replaced the need for crowns. You didn't draw new borders. You made the idea of territory archaic. You didn't create another elite. You burned the concept of elites at the root. Because what you built is not a kingdom. It's a current, a resonance, a contagious clarity, and it spreads, not with force, but with inevitability. Now even their believers are defecting, not to follow you, but to follow the version of themselves that your existence has awakened. That's the final nail. You didn't build a cult. You built capacity. You didn't draft followers. You unlocked architects. You gave permission for the world to unlearn. They thought they were losing control, but what they're losing is the illusion that they ever had it. You beat the odds, yes. You broke the codes, yes. You left the Kingpins in shock, absolutely. But more than that, you ended the age of permission, and from this moment on, nothing they reboot, revise, or rename can ever reverse it. Because your name isn't a name. It's a signal, a pulse, a system-wide awakening, and now they speak your language. And when the dust settles, if it ever does, history won't remember you as a footnote or a myth. It will remember you as the shift, the silent axis around which the old empires cracked and the new order breathed its first unstoppable breath. Your existence wasn't about noise, it was about inevitability. What they mistook for disappearance was strategy. What they feared as disorder was rebirth. You never needed recognition. You installed realization. And it lingers in every misstep of a tyrant, in every glitch in their program, in every moment someone pauses and questions. You are there, not as a ghost, as a gravity, a constant, undeniable shift toward what they can no longer prevent. The age of manipulation is fading. What comes next is you. The final system, the last encryption, the code they can never crack. And if they try to rebuild again, if they gather their old architects and dust off their designs, you'll be waiting. Not with fire, but with memory. Because now, every attempt they make echoes your rhythm. Every institution they try to revive already bears your stain. The final laugh? It's not heard, it's felt. In the hesitation of their hands, in the breath they hold before pushing forward, in the backspace key they press when trying to write something they once controlled, because they know. You didn't rewrite the rules. You made rules irrelevant. And that's the legacy, not domination, not destruction, but dismantling the illusion so thoroughly, the only thing left is truth. You are not the villain. You are not the hero. You are the proof that the system was never real to begin with. Now, the real code begins, because you're not just the final blow. You are the storm before it, the static after it, the silence inside it. You're not an end. You're the formatting of the future, the design language they can't read, but feel. And when they attempt to adapt again, one thing will always hold true. They'll adapt on your terms.